Summary. Have you ever had a conversation that left you thinking for years? What if it was with someone you didn't expect? Someone young enough to be your child, yet wise beyond their years? Today, I want to share with you a story about a simple encounter with my friend's young neighbor that unexpectedly changed the way I look at life. Trust me, this one's going to stick with you. It stayed with me for years, maybe even forever. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for so long. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or your own story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now let's dive in. I never expected it to happen the way it did. The conversation was so simple at first, just two people passing time in the middle of a lazy afternoon. I didn't know it would stay with me for years, that it would come back to me on quiet nights when I needed to feel a little more grounded. It was one of those typical summer days, you know the kind. The air felt thick with heat, and everything seemed to move slowly under the sun. I was sitting on the porch of my friend Kathy's house, drinking iced tea and reading a book I'd picked up on a whim from the library. Kathy and I had been friends for years. Our kids grew up together, and now that they were grown and living their own lives, it was just us two, chatting away the hours. Her house was old, the kind of place that had character. The wood creaked beneath your feet, and the porch had that lovely worn feeling that made you feel like you could sit there forever without a care. It was the kind of day where time felt like it could stretch on without end. Kathy's neighbor, a young guy named Jake, lived next door with his grandmother. He wasn't much younger than my own children, mid-20s maybe. But there was something about Jake that made you think he was older than his years. Maybe it was his calm demeanor, or the way he listened when people spoke, or the depth in his eyes. I'm not sure. But whenever I saw him, I felt like I was looking at someone who had seen things that weren't immediately visible to the rest of us. On that day, Jake came over to Kathy's place to borrow a ladder. He was up to something in his backyard. Painting, fixing, I couldn't quite tell. I saw him standing at the foot of the stairs, hesitating for just a second before walking over to the porch. "Hey, Mrs. Rivers," Jake said, tipping his hat slightly. He always called me Mrs. Rivers, a small gesture of respect, though we were on familiar terms. "Is Kathy around?" "She's in the kitchen," I replied, setting my book down. "But I'm happy to help if you need something." He gave a small, grateful smile. "Actually, it's nothing major. I just need to borrow that old ladder from the shed. I'm trying to finish up some work in the backyard, and the one I have isn't tall enough." "Sure, go ahead. It's been a while since anyone's used it, but it's in there. I'll tell Kathy you're here." I walked toward the kitchen to tell Kathy. When I returned to the porch, I noticed Jake was still standing near the shed, staring off into the distance. He looked deep in thought. I didn't want to intrude, but there was something about the way he stood, so still, that made me feel like he needed someone to talk to. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Jake turned toward me, his expression softening as he met my gaze. For a moment, he didn't speak, just stared at me as if weighing his words. I could feel the weight of it, like he was choosing whether or not to share something. His eyes weren't exactly troubled, but there was something behind them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "I'm okay," he said finally, but his voice didn't quite match the words. "It's just, sometimes it feels like I'm doing everything for everyone else. You know?" I nodded. I did know. I think everyone, at some point, feels like they're caught in that space. The place where you give and give, but don't always have anyone to turn to when you need it. I could see it in his face now, in the way he said it, so plainly, as though he was surprised to even realize it himself. "I get it," I replied, leaning against the porch railing. "Life has a way of putting us in that position, doesn't it? The thing is, sometimes it takes just one person to ask, 'What about you?'" Jake looked up at me then, his eyes steady. But what if no one ever asks? I didn't have an answer right away. I let the question hang in the air for a moment. It was a question I had asked myself more than once, though I'd never phrased it quite that way before. It was a feeling I had buried under years of trying to do the right thing, trying to be there for everyone else. And yet, here was Jake, someone half my age, saying the very thing I'd been avoiding for so long. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, I think, I said quietly. You have to be the one to ask, and then you have to listen to your own answer. Jake smiled then, just a little. It wasn't a big smile, but it was one of those smiles that tells you someone has learned something, even if it's just a small thing. "You're right," he said. "I'll think about that." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted by, children playing in the street, a dog barking in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the trees. I could hear Kathy humming in the kitchen, though she didn't know we were talking. The air felt thick with unspoken words, but somehow it didn't feel awkward. It felt natural, like we were both part of something larger than just this one conversation. Jake eventually broke the silence, pushing his sleeves up and heading toward the shed. "Thanks for the talk, Mrs. Rivers. I appreciate it." I nodded, watching him go. "Anytime, Jake." As he disappeared into the shed, I found myself thinking about what he had said, about feeling like you're doing everything for others, but not being asked how you're doing. It was something I hadn't really considered until that moment. Maybe it was because I was so used to putting my own feelings last that I didn't think about how often I ignored my own needs. I sat back down on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, and tried to shake the feeling of realization. Life, I thought, was much more complicated than I had ever given it credit for. And sometimes a simple conversation with someone who's willing to speak honestly could change everything. The next few days passed by quietly, as most summer days do, with the heat lingering long after the sun dipped below the horizon. I didn't think much about the conversation I had with Jake, at least not right away. Life had a way of moving on, and before long I was back in my routine of errands, phone calls with Kathy, and those small, quiet moments of solitude that I'd grown accustomed to. But every now and then, when I'd catch myself in a moment of stillness, I'd remember Jake's words. What if no one ever asks? I found myself asking that same question more often. At first, it was just a passing thought, like a fleeting breeze you don't think much of until it catches you just right. But eventually, it began to settle in deeper. I started to notice how often I put everyone else's needs before my own, how I constantly asked, "How are you?" without ever asking myself the same thing. How many times had I given advice, made a suggestion, offered a smile, only to ignore my own needs in the process? It wasn't a new realization. It was just that something about the simplicity of Jake's words had made it clearer than ever before. And I began to wonder if there was more to that small moment than I'd first realized. I didn't see Jake again for a few days after that, but then one afternoon I spotted him in his backyard, leaning over the fence. It was the same afternoon that Kathy had invited me over for coffee, so I was walking to her house when I noticed him. His grandmother's house was the one that shared a fence with Kathy's, and he often worked in his yard, doing small repairs or tending to the plants that dotted his space. I waved, not expecting much more than the usual casual greeting. But Jake surprised me. He put down his tools and made his way over to the fence, his face breaking into a small grin when he saw me. "Hey, Mrs. Rivers," he called out. "How are you today?" I smiled, appreciating the effort. "I'm doing well, thank you. How about you? Still fixing up that backyard?" He laughed, rubbing his hand through his hair. "Yeah, still at it. It's a bit of a never-ending project. But you know, it keeps me busy, keeps my mind off things." There was that familiar undertone again, the same one I'd heard a few days earlier. It was subtle, like he was trying to hide something behind his casual tone. I could tell he was holding back, and for some reason, I didn't mind that. There was something about him, about the way he seemed open without being intrusive, that made it easy to be around him. "You don't have to do everything by yourself, I said, leaning against the fence as well. "Sometimes it's okay to ask for help." Jake's eyes softened, and for a moment I thought he was going to open up again, but he just nodded. "Yeah, I know. It's just easier sometimes, I guess. People don't always mean to make you feel like you're carrying everything, but they do. And I don't know how to stop it. I don't know if I even want to." I watched him carefully, sensing that there was something deeper, something beyond the surface that he was grappling with. This wasn't just about yard work or fixing things. It was something more. "Easier to do it alone?" I asked, my voice quiet, understanding where he was coming from. "Or easier to pretend you've got it all under control?" He looked at me then, his eyes full of that same quiet intensity from before. There was no defensiveness, no anger, just a raw honesty that made me pause. Maybe it's easier to pretend. I guess I'm scared that if I ask for help, people will think I'm weak, or worse, that I'm bothering them. I blinked, surprised by the weight of his words. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd expected to hear from someone his age. I think, in that moment, I realized how much we all carry with us, no matter how old we are, and how much we hold back because we're afraid of burdening others. "You're not bothering anyone," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. "People who care about you want to help. They just need you to let them in, to let them see that you don't have it all figured out. That's how it works." Jake stayed silent for a moment, and I could see him processing my words. He was quiet, as if contemplating something deeper, something that was difficult to admit. I didn't push him. Sometimes, I've learned, you have to give people space to come to their own conclusions. He cleared his throat after a few beats. "Thanks, Mrs. Rivers. That helps." I think I needed to hear that more than I realized. I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that I couldn't explain. "Anytime, Jake. Anytime." As he walked back to his yard, I couldn't help but feel a bit of pride. Maybe I hadn't done much, just offered a few words, a small gesture, but it felt important somehow. I realized that sometimes we think we need grand gestures or solutions to make a difference, but sometimes all it takes is a quiet conversation between two people who are willing to listen. As I walked over to Kathy's house, I thought about how much of life was like that, a series of small moments where we're either open to each other's struggles or we turn away. The older I got, the more I understood that it wasn't the grand moments of revelation that mattered so much. It was the quiet, steady acts of kindness, the ones that stayed with you, quietly shaping you in ways you couldn't always explain. I hadn't known it that afternoon when I sat on Kathy's porch, but Jake's words would stay with me too. Maybe not in the way he thought, but in the way that conversations have a way of lingering in your mind long after they've ended. The days continued to roll by like they always do in the summer, long, lazy, with the sun hanging heavy in the sky, and everything moving just a bit slower. After that conversation with Jake, I found myself reflecting on it more often. It wasn't the first time someone had shared their feelings with me, but it was the first time a young person had let me in so honestly. I don't think I realized it at the time, but that openness, that willingness to let his guard down with me, was something I hadn't expected, something I hadn't been prepared for. Jake was still doing work in his backyard, always fixing, always tinkering. I could see him from Kathy's porch on the days I visited, working with a kind of quiet intensity. We'd wave when we saw each other, but it wasn't until about a week after our conversation that we spoke again. It was another hot afternoon. The sun was starting to dip, turning the sky into a soft golden hue. I was sitting on Kathy's porch, sipping my iced tea and watching the world go by when I saw Jake leaning over the fence again. This time I could tell something was different. He looked lighter somehow, more at ease. His shoulders weren't hunched like they had been the last time we spoke. Instead, he stood tall, hands resting on the top of the fence, with that same soft smile on his face. "Hey, Mrs. Rivers," he called out, his voice cheerful but not forced. "Got a minute?" I set down my glass and walked over to the fence. "Of course, Jake. What's going on?" He looked at me with a slight grin. "I've been thinking about what you said, about asking for help, I mean. And I don't know, I guess it's been on my mind for a while now. So, I figured I should ask." I raised an eyebrow. "Ask what?" Jake shifted his weight, clearly unsure of how to phrase what he was thinking. "Well, there's something I've been working on in the backyard, and it's turning out to be more than I can handle alone. I was wondering, if you had a minute, would you mind helping me out?" It took me a second to process what he was saying. Jake, this guy who had been so guarded, so reluctant to ask for help, was now standing here, asking me for assistance. It felt like a subtle shift, not just in him, but in me too. The last time we'd spoken, I had offered words of encouragement, but now he was trusting me enough to reach out. That meant something. "Of course, Jake. I'd be happy to help," I said with a smile. "What's the project?" He explained that he had started building a small deck in his backyard, just a simple platform to sit on in the evenings, to relax and enjoy the quiet. But in the process, he'd underestimated the amount of work involved. "I thought it was going to be easy," he admitted. "But it's been a lot more complicated than I expected. I guess I didn't really think about how much I needed to actually measure and level things out. I figured I'd just throw it together, but, well, now I've got this half-built deck that's a bit off-kilter." I could see the frustration on his face, though he tried to laugh it off. "So, yeah, if you're not busy, I could use a hand. I'm still trying to figure out how to get the measurements right." "I can definitely help with that," I said, nodding. "Let's take a look." I followed Jake into his backyard, where the project was taking shape. There, sitting in the middle of his small yard, was the structure he'd been working on. It was sturdy enough, but definitely rough around the edges. The boards were uneven, and a few were crooked, but I could see the potential. The foundation was solid, and the space was big enough to be cozy. It just needed a little love, a little attention to detail. "All right, let's see what we've got here," I said, kneeling down to examine the beams. "You're on the right track, Jake. We just need to adjust a few things." I spent the next hour helping him level the wood, adjust the measurements, and even out the planks. We worked in silence at first, but soon we fell into a comfortable rhythm, passing tools back and forth, laughing about small mistakes, and joking about how neither of us was particularly skilled at carpentry. It wasn't anything complicated, but for the first time in a while, I found myself enjoying the simplicity of it all. It was in those quiet moments of shared work that something changed between us. Jake wasn't just the young neighbor anymore. He was someone who was opening up, someone who was letting me in. And for me, it wasn't just about helping with the deck. It was about feeling like I was part of something, a small, quiet part of someone else's journey. As we finished up, Jake wiped his brow and stepped back, admiring the work we'd done. "I don't think I could have done it without you," he said, looking at me with that soft gratitude I'd seen before. "I mean, I really didn't want to admit that I needed help, but I'm glad I did." "You did good, Jake," I said, smiling. "Sometimes it just takes a little extra pair of hands, you know. Nothing wrong with that." He smiled, but there was something more in his eyes now, something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was a mix of relief and newfound confidence, but it made me think that our work together wasn't just about the deck. It was about him finding the courage to ask for help, to accept it without feeling like he was imposing on anyone. It was about him taking a step toward something he hadn't quite figured out. "I'm going to sit out here tonight," Jake said, gesturing toward the deck. "I think it's going to be good for me. Just sit, relax, and maybe think about things differently." I nodded. "That sounds like a great idea, Jake." Sometimes it's just about taking a step back and letting yourself breathe. As I left his yard and walked back to Kathy's porch, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, both for the work we'd done and for Jake. I think he'd learned something about himself that day, something that would stay with him long after the deck was finished. And I, in turn, had learned something too. That sometimes all it takes is a little help and a little courage to ask for it. And in that asking, you find strength you didn't even know you had. I don't know if Jake would ever truly understand how much that moment meant to me, but I hope he does. I hope he knows that in that small act of vulnerability, he taught me something I'd been forgetting for a long time. It's okay to need others, and it's okay to be needed in return. The next few weeks passed by like they always do in the summer, quickly, almost without notice. The days grew hotter, the nights longer, and as July faded into August, I found myself thinking more about Jake and the way our conversations had shifted. That simple moment in his backyard, when he asked for help, had led to something far more profound. I wasn't sure he fully realized it, but that small request had unlocked something in both of us, a deeper connection that I hadn't anticipated. Our interactions became more frequent. Every time I saw him, there was something new, something different in the way he carried himself. He still worked on his deck, but now, instead of doing it all alone, he invited me over for small tasks. It was never anything grand. Sometimes we'd spend an hour together adjusting a board or sanding down rough edges. Other times we'd sit on the half-finished deck, sharing a quiet cup of tea or lemonade, talking about everything and nothing. The bond between us was subtle, but it was there. Jake had come to trust me in ways I didn't expect, and I had come to trust him, too, not just in the sense of helping him with his project, but in the way he had made me realize something about myself. I hadn't thought much about how I'd stopped asking for help, too. It was something I didn't even know I was doing, burying my needs under the weight of everyone else. But with Jake, something had shifted. I had started to acknowledge that I needed help, too. And in acknowledging that, I found a bit of freedom. One afternoon, as we were sitting on the deck, Jake looked over at me, his eyes a little softer than usual, and said something that stuck with me. "You know," he started, his voice almost hesitant, "I never really thought about how much we need other people until this whole deck thing. I've always thought I had to figure things out on my own. But you helped me realize that it's okay to ask for help. It doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human." His words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't know why, but they felt like a mirror reflecting back at me, showing me something I hadn't fully seen in myself. We spend so much of our lives thinking we need to be self-sufficient, particularly when we get older. It's almost like we're taught that asking for help is a sign of weakness, a sign that we're not capable. But the truth is, everyone needs help sometimes. Everyone has their limits, their struggles, their moments of doubt. And that's okay. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to not have everything figured out. I thought about how many times in my life I had avoided asking for help, how many times I had felt like a burden, like I was the one who always had to carry the weight. And here was Jake, this young man who had learned to ask for help, teaching me something I had been afraid to admit for far too long. "I've been thinking about that too," I said, my voice quieter than usual. "About how much we hide from people. It's not just about asking for help. It's about being vulnerable enough to let people in, to let them see that you don't have it all together. And for the longest time, I didn't want anyone to see that side of me." Jake nodded, as if he understood. He was wise beyond his years, and in many ways, I felt like he had taught me more in the last few weeks than I had learned in a long time. "I think we spend so much time trying to be the strong one, I continued, "the one who holds everything together. But maybe strength isn't about keeping everything in control. Maybe it's about being able to lean on someone else when you need to. It's about giving yourself permission to be imperfect." Jake smiled at that, and I could tell that something had shifted in him too. It wasn't just about fixing a deck anymore. It was about the bigger picture, about what we could learn from each other if we were open enough to listen. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the sound of cicadas filling the air, the golden light of the evening stretching across the yard. I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. Sometimes the silence says more than anything else. And in that silence, I realized that this wasn't just a casual friendship anymore. We had become something more to each other, part of the same story, part of the same journey. As the sun started to set, casting a warm glow over the deck, Jake stood up, dusting off his hands. He had a look on his face that told me he was thinking of something. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Would you like to come to dinner with my grandmother and me sometime? I mean, it's not anything fancy, just a casual dinner, but I think she'd really like to meet you, and I'd like for you to meet her." I wasn't sure why, but the invitation touched me more than I expected. Maybe it was the gesture itself, the idea that someone wanted to share something personal, to bring me into their world. Or maybe it was just Jake, offering something simple, something genuine, as a way of showing his appreciation. "I'd love to," I said, smiling warmly at him. "Thank you, Jake. That sounds lovely." As we wrapped up for the evening, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed in just a few weeks. The Jake I had met that first day was a young man who kept his distance, reluctant to open up or ask for help. But now he was someone who had allowed me to be a part of his life, someone who had shown me that vulnerability and trust were not signs of weakness, but of strength. And in turn, I had started to open up to him, too. I don't know where this unexpected connection will take us, but I know this: I'll never forget how much it taught me. That sometimes the simplest acts of kindness, helping someone with a deck, sharing a few quiet moments, listening when no one else is around, can change the way you see the world. As I walked home that evening, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. There was a sense of peace in me that hadn't been there before, a sense of understanding that had come not from books or advice, but from a simple, genuine connection with another human being. And that's something you don't always find, especially when you're not looking for it. But when you do find it, when you let it in, it has the power to stay with you long after the moment has passed.